I saw with my own eyes the young millionaire Richard accept that cruel bet while holding a crystal glass filled with expensive liquor in his hand and laughing with his friends in the most exclusive club in Greenwich, Connecticut. The deal was heartless, but terribly simple. He had to marry Mary, a woman everyone in town looked at with mockery because she was obese and far from the aesthetic standards of that superficial world, and stay tied to her for at least 6 months. At stake was $1 million, a fortune that would have further fueled the power of that arrogant man who was used to winning in every deal and every challenge in life. Richard thought it would be an easy game, a way to have fun at the expense of a poor woman and prove his superiority to his drinking companions. Everyone laughed at Mary that day, but I, who was standing in a corner of the club serving coffee and putting away their heavy coats, felt a cold inside that did not come from the New England winter. I knew that Mary was not the defenseless victim they imagined. That woman hid a very deep secret, a searing pain that Richard himself had caused years before without ever showing a shred of remorse. In the 6th month of marriage, the incredible happened, and the young millionaire was left speechless when the truth finally came to light, destroying his mask of perfection forever and putting him in front of the consequences of his actions. Good morning, everyone. My name is Martha, and today I am 75 years old. I have lived in this town since I was born, and I have seen many people pass by, many fortunes born, and many lives broken. Everything started on a winter evening in Greenwich. I worked as an assistant and cloakroom attendant in a very renowned private club, a place where the floors were polished marble and the walls were covered with dark, precious wood. It was an environment frequented only by the most powerful men in the area. Richard was one of the youngest members, a successful man who never accepted no for an answer. That evening, the club was full of cigar smoke and the sound of glasses touching. Richard was sitting at a corner table with Simon, a friend of his who was equally cynical and a lover of cruel challenges. They were drinking and talking about business and women as if everything were for sale. I heard Simon laugh in a vulgar way and throw down the challenge. He said it was easy for someone like Richard to be with beautiful, thin women, but that he would never have the guts to marry a woman who did not fit his usual standards of beauty. Richard raised an eyebrow, stung in his pride. Simon proposed the figure, $1 million if he married Mary and stayed with her for 6 months. Richard, feeling the push of competition and the charm of that financial challenge, accepted without a moment of hesitation. For him, Mary was just a name, a piece on a chessboard to be moved to win a bet. I was nearby, tidying up the members' silk scarves, and I felt a shiver of anger. I knew the story of Mary's family. Her father, John, had been the owner of a supply company that had been crushed without mercy by Richard's financial maneuvers years before. John had not been able to withstand the weight of failure and shame and had taken his own life, leaving Mary and her mother in a dignified but extreme poverty. Mary was a large woman, obese according to medical terms, and Greenwich society did not forgive her for that body that took up space. Yet Mary carried that weight with a dignity that none of those men could ever understand. A few days later, Richard showed up at Mary's house to make his proposal. I do not know what he officially told her, but I am certain he used all his manipulative charm to convince her that this marriage would help her economic situation. I was called by Richard to take care of the wedding dress. He told me he wanted a person of trust who would not ask questions and who knew how to work with fabric well. When I arrived at Mary's house, a modest building in a less noble area of the city, I expected to find a woman who was confused or perhaps frightened. Instead, Mary welcomed me into a clean but bare kitchen. She was sitting on a wooden chair and looked at me with a firmness that left me speechless. I started taking measurements in silence. As the tape measure went around her body, I felt that Mary was motionless, like a statue. There was no joy in her eyes, but there was also none of the despair I would have imagined in a bride who knows she is part of a bet. I asked her if she was sure she wanted to marry Richard. I knew well what they said about her at the club. I knew that Simon and the others laughed, imagining Richard next to her. Mary answered me in a calm, low voice. She told me she knew exactly who Richard was and that she knew every detail of the bet. At that moment, I froze. If she knew about the bet, why did she agree to let herself be humiliated in that way? Mary looked at me steadily and added that Richard believed he had control of the situation, but that sometimes those in power forget to look at those they have stepped on to reach the top. While I was adjusting the fabric on her shoulders, I noticed that Mary was keeping an eye on a small drawer in the table. When she opened it to look for a ribbon, I saw old accounting documents made out to her father John and a faded photograph. It was the photo of a newborn, a memory that seemed to cause her immense pain. Mary closed the drawer immediately, but her breath became heavier for an instant. The wedding was organized with a haste that clearly showed Richard's contempt for the event. He just wanted to sign the papers and start counting the months to collect the $1 million. I continued to go to Mary's for the dress fittings. Every time, I found her more and more focused. She told me that after her father's death, she and her mother had to fight for every piece of bread, while Richard built his empire on the ruins of their lives. She told me that there were things money could not buy and that Richard was about to receive the most important lesson of his life. Richard, meanwhile, continued to frequent the club. He bragged to Simon about how Mary was easy to manipulate and how she had no idea why he had chosen her. He said that women like her were grateful for even a shred of attention from a man like him. I was carrying porcelain plates to their table and had to grit my teeth not to spill everything on Richard. His arrogance was unbearable. He did not see Mary as a person, but as a temporary punishment to endure to get even richer. The evening before the wedding, I went back one last time to Mary's to bring her the finished dress. It was a simple silk dress, without frills, made specifically not to attract useless stares. Mary put it on and looked at herself in her bedroom mirror. She was not looking for the beauty that Richard demanded from his mistresses. She was looking for strength. She paid me carefully, counting the coins with extreme precision. She told me that after the ceremony, Richard would take her to his luxurious penthouse in downtown Greenwich, a place full of glass and cold furniture that Mary called her new prison. She asked me to continue visiting her there with the excuse of fixing her clothes, because she would need someone who knew the truth. I left that house feeling the cold wind hit my face. Greenwich was dark and silent, but under that calm surface, something explosive was boiling. Mary was not a happy bride, and she was not a deceived bride. She was a woman who was entering the lion's den with an objective that no one could suspect. Richard thought he had won the bet before even starting, but he did not know that Mary had kept every proof of his past crimes and that the debt Richard had with John's family would not be paid with Simon's $1 million, but with something much more precious. I walked home thinking about that bet, born among laughter and cigar smoke. Richard had agreed to marry an obese woman for money, convinced that 6 months of living together were an acceptable price to pay for $1 million. But as I prepared my bag for the next day, I could not get the look on Mary's face in front of the mirror out of my head. It was the look of someone who has nothing left to lose because she has already lost everything that really mattered, including the child she carried years before and that she had never been able to hold in her arms because of the poverty caused by Richard. The game had started, and Richard had no idea that the woman he considered a simple aesthetic obstacle would be his downfall. The following morning, the air was clear and freezing. I arrived early to help Mary dress for the civil ceremony. The house was even quieter than usual. Mary got out of bed with a calmness that frightened me. There was no trace of emotion on her face as she slipped on the silk dress I had sewn with such care. She thanked me with a nod of her head. As I adjusted the short veil over her face, my hands shook slightly. I knew that day would stay in history, not for the beauty of the bride, but for the cruelty of the reason that had brought those two before the official. Richard arrived shortly after in his luxury car that looked out of place in that modest street. He did not even get out of the car to go and get Mary at the door. He waited for her to come out, looking at her through the dark windows with an expression of contempt that made my blood boil. Mary walked with a firm step, without turning back to look at her old house. She got into the car and I followed her with my eyes until they disappeared around the corner of the street, heading towards the city center where everything was ready for the signing of the documents that would start the 6-month period provided by the bet. When I arrived at the town hall, I found Simon and the other club members already there waiting. They were snickering among themselves, exchanging knowing glances as Mary made her entrance into the room. Richard was standing next to the table, looking at his watch as if he had a much more important appointment immediately after. The ceremony was rapid, cold, and devoid of any human warmth. There were no sincere promises of love, only signatures placed on pieces of paper that tied two destinies for a shameful reason. Mary signed with a firm and decisive handwriting without ever looking away from the paper. Immediately after the signature, Richard turned to Simon and gave him a quick nod, as if to say that the first part of the deal was successfully concluded. He did not say a word to Mary. He took her by the arm in a brusque way and led her towards the exit, where the photographers he himself had called to document the event were taking photos that would go around the good drawing rooms of the city. Mary kept her head high, ignoring the flashes and the murmurs of the curious crowd that had gathered outside the building to see the bride everyone was talking about. They got into the car again, and this time they headed towards Richard's penthouse. I took my coat and started walking home, knowing that my task as a seamstress had just become that of an observer in a house that would never be a domestic hearth. I knew that Mary would spend her first night in that glass and marble villa surrounded by a man who despised her, but I also knew that every hour spent in that house was for her a step forward towards the justice she had been seeking for years. The bet had been officially sealed, and the 6-month countdown had begun amid Richard's indifference and Mary's silent determination. As I walked under the trees of Greenwich, I could not help but think about how blind Richard was. He thought he had bought Mary's silence and submission with the promise of a comfortable life for a few months, but he did not realize that Mary was not looking for his money. She was looking for the truth that he had tried to bury along with John's company. Richard thought he was the predator, but that day, as the doors of his luxurious penthouse closed behind them, he did not know he had just welcomed into his home the person who would dismantle his entire existence built on the pain of others piece by piece. I hope I have been clear in describing the atmosphere of that day that changed everything for Mary and Richard, marking the beginning of a coexistence that no one in the city would ever be able to forget for its cruelty and for the incredible ending that was slowly taking shape in the shadows of the villa's large rooms. The reception that followed that cold signing was not a common wedding party, but a sort of macabre spectacle organized for the pleasure of a few elites in Richard's penthouse in the heart of Greenwich. As soon as I crossed the threshold of that home, made of enormous glass windows and white marble floors, I felt that the air was charged with a mean electricity. Richard's friends were already there, with their tailored suits and the smiles of those who know they have paid for a ticket to a unique show. Simon, the promoter of the bet, held a glass of champagne in his hand and watched Mary enter with an expression that could not hide his contempt. Mary walked slowly, occupying the space with a physical presence that clashed terribly with the minimalist and thin decor of that luxury house. Richard did not even offer her his arm to accompany her among the guests. He limited himself to a generic nod towards the center of the room, as if he were introducing a new and bizarre piece of furniture. I had offered to help with the service so I could stay close to Mary, and what I saw made me grip the tray in my hands until my knuckles turned white. The guests did not speak to Mary. They spoke about her as if she were invisible or incapable of understanding. I heard whispers under the internal arches of the apartment, poisonous jokes about the width of her waistline compared to that of the Swedish design chairs. Simon approached Richard and with a pat on the back that echoed through the room, said loudly enough to be heard, "Congratulations, Richard. You are a man of your word. I do not know how you will manage to wake up next to her for 6 months, but $1 million is well worth some sacrifice of sight." Richard burst out laughing, a dry laugh devoid of joy, while casting a sidelong glance at his wife. Mary was standing near a large crystal table. Instead of lowering her gaze or running to cry in the bathroom, as anyone else would have done, something happened that left me and the others speechless. Mary raised her head and looked Simon straight in the eyes. There was no hatred in her gaze, but a sort of icy pity that made the smile vanish from the man's face. Mary took a glass of water, drank a sip with extreme calmness, and then turned to Richard, telling him in a firm voice that the guests seemed to have a very limited conversation for being such educated people. It was a moment of absolute silence. Richard, surprised by that composed and intelligent reaction, did not know what to answer. For a moment, the arrogance of the master of the house faltered before the unassailable dignity of that woman he considered only a pawn. The evening continued in that climate of constant tension. I tried to catch Mary's eye to transmit some warmth to her, but she seemed to have built a wall around herself. She was present, but her spirit seemed elsewhere, perhaps busy counting the seconds of that necessary martyrdom. When the last guests left, leaving the house soaked in smoke and malice, Richard took off his jacket and threw it carelessly on the leather sofa. He addressed Mary with a tone that allowed no reply, telling her that her duties were minimal. She must not disturb him, she must attend official events when requested, and above all, she must not have any illusions about the nature of that bond. Mary listened to him without interrupting, with her hands clasped in front of her. When he finished his monologue full of poison, she simply said that she would sleep in the guest room and that she had no intention of interfering with his business as long as he did not interfere with her freedom to move around the house. In the following days, life in the penthouse became a cold war made of silences and small acts of resistance. Richard immediately tried to impose his authority through the power of money. He brought home packages full of expensive jewelry and designer silk dresses, telling Mary that, since she had to be his wife for 6 months, she should at least try to appear presentable according to his rank. He expected her to fall to her knees in gratitude, as many other women had done before her. Instead, Mary looked at those luxury items with an indifference that hurt Richard's pride more than 1,000 words. She told him that she did not need his gold to know what she was worth, and that those clothes were not suitable for her, nor for her life, nor for the reason she was there. Richard was furious. He was not used to being rejected, especially by someone he considered inferior. He began to treat her like a transparent object. When Mary entered a room, he left without saying a word. If she was reading a book in the living room, he turned the music up to full volume to disturb her. Yet, Mary never lost her composure. I went to visit her with the excuse of having to fix some hems, and often found her sitting near the large window that looked out over Greenwich. She told me that Richard's silence was the sweetest sound she could hear, because it allowed her to think and to better observe how his life worked. One morning, while Richard was out for an important business meeting, Mary asked me to accompany her to his study. I was terrified, knowing how jealous Richard was of his spaces and his secrets. Mary, however, did not seem afraid. She began to look at the shelves full of folders and accounting documents. She was looking for something specific, something related to her father John's old company. She told me that her family's failure had not been an unfortunate accident, but a calculated maneuver to steal the land where one of Richard's most profitable buildings now stood. I saw her leaf through the registers with incredible speed, marking names and dates in a small notebook she kept hidden in the pocket of her dressing gown. At that moment, I understood that Mary was playing a game much more dangerous than Richard's bet. She was not just trying to survive 6 months of humiliation. She was looking for the evidence to destroy the man who had destroyed her family. Every time we heard the sound of the elevator, we immediately went back into the hallway, pretending to discuss the quality of the fabrics. Richard suspected nothing. To him, Mary was just a woman too large for his tastes, who occupied space in his apartment, a necessary nuisance to collect that $1 million at the end of the semester. The humiliation, however, did not stop at the domestic walls. Richard began taking her to business dinners, introducing her with an ironic smile to his partners. He wanted to see if she would crumble under the weight of the judging stares of the thin and fur-clad wives of his collaborators. During one of these dinners, a very elegant woman allowed herself to make a sarcastic comment about Mary's appetite, suggesting that perhaps a diet would be the best wedding gift Richard could give her. The table fell into an embarrassed silence. Richard did not move a finger to defend her. In fact, he seemed amused by the situation. Mary placed her cutlery down with a grace that made that woman look like an ill-mannered teenager. She replied that beauty was a passing and often superficial concept, but that a lack of education was a stain that no surgeon or diet could ever remove. She added that she found it fascinating how such rich people had conversations so poor in spirit. Richard stopped laughing. There was something in the way Mary dominated the conversation, despite her weight and despite the hatred that surrounded her, that began to make him uncomfortable. She was not the submissive and grateful woman he had imagined he could manipulate as he pleased. Back at the penthouse that night, the silence was broken by the sound of the heavy front door slamming shut. Richard exploded the moment we were inside. He yelled at Mary that she should not have dared to embarrass his guests, and that her presence was already difficult enough to bear without her opening her mouth. Mary looked at him with an Olympic calmness. She told him that the only one who was embarrassed was him, because he realized that his wife was more intelligent than all his friends put together. Richard stepped toward her, towering over her with his athletic frame, but Mary did not take a step back. She reminded him that the 6-month contract provided for her presence, not her silence in the face of rudeness. I saw Richard clench his fists and leave for his room, slamming another door behind him. Mary remained alone in the dark hallway. I approached her and asked her how she could endure all that poison without breaking. She took my hand and told me that every insult from Richard was a reminder of why she had to go all the way. She spoke to me of her father, John, of how that strong man had been reduced to a shadow by debts and legal threats from Richard's lawyers. She told me that the physical pain of an insult was nothing compared to the pain of seeing her life go up in smoke while Richard celebrated his successes. In the weeks that followed, I noticed a subtle change in Richard. Instead of ignoring her completely, he began to observe her. He watched her while she ate breakfast. He watched her while she walked through the house with that heavy but decisive step. It was as if he were trying to understand what was under that armor of weight and dignity that he could not scratch. He began to ask her questions about her education, trying to challenge her on complex themes of economics or art, only to discover that Mary knew more than he did. This discovery irritated and fascinated him at the same time. Mary, for her part, granted him nothing. She did not try to please him. She did not try to make him like her. She maintained that icy distance that was her best defense and her sharpest weapon. She knew that Richard was used to women who hung on his every word, and her indifference was driving him crazy. One evening, I saw him standing in front of the door of the guest room where Mary was sleeping. He did not go in, but remained there for several minutes with a confused expression on his face, as if he were wondering who the woman he had brought into his house for a bet really was. I continued to do my part, bringing news from the club and helping Mary hide the documents she managed to take from the study. We both knew that time was passing and that the 6-month deadline was approaching, but we also knew that the tension between the two of them was becoming unbearable. The glass and marble house, which was supposed to be the stage for Richard's triumph, was turning into a battlefield where the weapons were not money, but truth and the courage to face the past. Mary told me one afternoon that Richard had started checking her movements more carefully. He was afraid that she might find out too much or that she might ruin his public image. He had even tried to prevent her from going out to do the grocery shopping alone, saying that the wife of a man in his position should use the service staff. Mary had replied that she was not his property and that she would continue to live her life as she saw fit, with or without his permission. That was the first time I saw Richard truly worried. He was no longer sure who was the cat and who was the mouse in that cruel game. Living together had become an exercise in steady nerves. Richard sought every opportunity to remind her of her physical condition, leaving fashion magazines open on pages that celebrated extreme thinness, or making sarcastic comments when he saw her eating. Mary responded by eating with a slow and deliberate calmness, looking him straight in the eyes, as if to say that his contempt had no power over her body. It was a form of passive resistance that left Richard without arguments, emptied of his usual verbal aggression. I felt that the situation was about to explode. Richard could no longer hide the fact that Mary occupied his thoughts much more than he would ever admit to Simon or to himself. It was not love, not yet. It was an obsession born from the fact of not being able to dominate someone. And Mary, I knew well, was just waiting for the moment when he would be most vulnerable to strike. She had collected enough information about John's firm and the illicit dealings Richard had used to expand. She was only missing one last piece of the puzzle, a document that Richard kept in a hidden safe behind a painting in the study. While I was waxing the floors of the hallway, I observed that strange couple living in separate worlds under the same roof. Mary, with her bulk and her ancient wisdom, and Richard, with his plastic beauty and his inner emptiness. I wondered what would happen when the 6 months were over. Would Richard collect the $1 million and kick Mary out? Or would the truth she was about to reveal destroy not only the bet, but the entire life of that arrogant man? The answer seemed written in the shadows that lengthened on the white walls of the penthouse, while the ticking of the clock in the living room marked the approach of a storm that neither of them could avoid. Mary began to spend entire evenings writing in a diary, closed in her room. She told me it was her life insurance. If anything happened to her, that diary would get into the right hands. She did not trust Richard, and she was right. The man who had agreed to marry her for a game was capable of anything just to not lose face or his assets. But Mary had a strength that came from the deepest pain, that of someone who has seen loved ones die for the greed of others, and that strength made her untouchable, almost superhuman in the eyes of someone like me, who knew what was really happening behind that facade of a marriage of convenience. Life in Greenwich continued with its slow pace, unaware of the drama unfolding in that luxury penthouse. The people on the streets continued to gossip about the strange couple, laughing at Mary and envying Richard, without suspecting that the woman they laughed at was about to bring the king of the city to his knees. Every time I left that house, I felt the weight of the secret I carried with me. A secret that weighed much more than any dress or jewelry Richard had ever bought. I knew that the next step would be the decisive one, the one that would turn the bet into a tragedy or an unpredictable redemption for both. The shadows were indeed lengthening in that oversized living room of the penthouse, and I continued to frequent that house with the excuse of having to fix Mary's wardrobe for the changing season. Entering that luxurious home was like entering a pressure chamber where every breath seemed to weigh double. Richard, who had always been used to winning in every deal and in every aspect of his comfortable life, could not understand why Mary was not bending to his will. He was convinced that once Mary was brought into that world of marble and crystal, she would become like all the other women he had known, grateful for the luxury and ready to submit to his power just to not lose those privileges. But Mary was not like the others. She showed no admiration for the wealth that surrounded her. She looked at the immense windows that overlooked the city with a look of defiance that drove Richard out of his mind. Richard began to play more aggressively because he felt his authority was being questioned for the first time. He tried the path he knew best, that of expensive gifts. One afternoon, He arrived home with a velvet box containing a diamond necklace that could have paid the salary of a factory worker for 10 years. He placed it on the table in front of Mary while she was reading a book on art history. He did not ask her how she was. He only told her that such a jewel would distract his friend's attention from her out-of-standard body during the next dinner at the club. Mary did not even look up from the book for several seconds. Then, with a calmness that gave me chills, she closed the volume and replied to him that she did not need those stones to shine and that she did not want anything that was bought with contempt. Richard took that box and threw it against the wall, yelling that she was an ingrate and that any other woman would have knelt for such a gift. Mary rose from the chair with a deliberate slowness, occupying all the space her size allowed, and told him that perhaps the problem was precisely that. He was surrounded by people who knelt before his money, but she did not have knees made for that type of submission. I saw Richard remain in silence, with labored breathing and a face red with anger, and, for the first time, confusion. He then began to sabotage her daily routine to remind her who was in charge. Mary had maintained a small part-time job in a neighborhood library, a job that gave her the little she needed to be independent. Richard began to have the car keys hidden by the service staff or ordered the drivers not to accompany her, claiming that a wife of her rank should not be seen in such modest places. When Mary decided to walk in the rain just to not miss her commitment, Richard stopped her at the door, blocking her path with his arm. He told her she did not need that miserable salary, but Mary looked him straight in the eyes and replied that what she was looking for was not the salary, but her self-respect, something he did not seem to possess at all. That evening, Mary came into the kitchen where I was preparing tea. She had wet shoes and tired feet. I sat next to her and asked her why she continued to challenge him so openly. Mary took my hands and whispered to me that every attempt of Richard's to control her confirmed to her how weak he was inside. She told me that her father, John, had never treated her like an object, even when they had lost everything. She told me that Richard was trying to break her will because she was the mirror of his own moral mediocrity. While we were talking, we heard Richard's footsteps in the hallway. He came into the kitchen, which he rarely did, and looked at us with suspicion. Instead of yelling, he poured himself a glass of water and remained there, watching Mary drink her tea in silence. There was something new in his gaze, a sort of tormented curiosity. Months passed, and the tension in the penthouse became a constant physical presence, like an invisible wall between the two spouses. Richard began to feel the weight of the bet differently. Simon called him often to tease him, asking him how the forced coexistence was going and reminding him that the $1 million awaited him at the end of the semester. But Richard did not laugh as before. During one of these calls, which I overheard while tidying up the study, Richard replied to Simon in a sharp tone, telling him not to interfere in his private business. It seemed that the idea of the bet was starting to disgust him, or perhaps it was the idea that Mary might find out everything that was tormenting him. He did not know that Mary already knew everything since the first day. This discovery irritated and fascinated him at the same time. Richard began to seek Mary's company in an almost obsessive way, showing up in the rooms where she was just to stay there and watch her read or write. It was as if he were trying to decipher a secret code. Mary, however, remained an impregnable fortress. She did not grant him a smile. She did not grant him a word of comfort. She continued her secret research, and I helped her put the folders back in the study every time Richard went out for his business meetings. One Saturday afternoon, Richard found Mary in the study. She was not searching for documents. She was simply looking at a painting that depicted an ancient view of the city. Richard approached her and, with a tone strangely mild for his standards, asked her what she saw in that painting. Mary began to explain the painter's technique and the historical significance of that view with a competence and a passion that left him speechless. He, who had bought that painting only because it was expensive and prestigious, realized he had never understood anything about the work he owned. Mary told him that beauty was not something that could be possessed with a check, but something that one had to have the capacity to feel inside oneself. Richard remained watching her as she left the room, and I saw that his hands were shaking slightly. He was starting to see Mary no longer as an aesthetic obstacle, but as a person endowed with a superiority that he would never reach. This change in Richard did not immediately lead to peace. On the contrary, it made his reactions even more unpredictable. During this period, Richard tried to isolate Mary even more, perhaps hoping that loneliness would push her into his arms or induce her to ask him for forgiveness for her independence. He prevented her from receiving visitors, apart from me, and made sure that the people she knew at the library no longer contacted her. He thought that by making her life difficult, she would finally give in. But Mary did not crumble. Every blow from Richard made her more determined. One evening, during a particularly silent dinner, Richard told her that he did not understand why she insisted on living as if she were still poor when she had everything at her disposal. Mary put down her cutlery and replied that he had everything that money could buy, but that she had everything that money could not touch, her dignity and her truth. Richard felt those words like a punch in the stomach. He got up from the table and went out onto the balcony, looking at the city under the rain. I was in the kitchen and could see him through the glass. He seemed like a lost man, no longer the arrogant millionaire who had accepted a bet out of boredom and greed. He was starting to feel something he did not know how to handle: guilt, and perhaps a deep attraction for the mind of that woman he had tried to humiliate. Mary, meanwhile, remained seated at the table with her gaze fixed on the void. I approached to clear the table, and she whispered to me that the time was about to run out and that the truth would be much more painful than Richard could imagine. One evening, Mary finally found what she was looking for. It was a credit assignment contract signed years before, where the signature of her father John seemed strangely trembling, almost forced. Mary photographed that document with an old camera she kept hidden and told me that the puzzle was almost complete. The 6th month of marriage was now at the door, and the atmosphere in the villa had become almost unbreathable. Richard desperately sought to find a way to apologize without losing face, reaching the point of bringing her breakfast in bed or asking her advice on certain work decisions. Mary accepted these attentions with a cold courtesy, without ever letting herself go into a true confidence. Richard was tormented by the idea that the contract was about to end. He no longer wanted her to go away, but he did not know how to ask her to stay after everything he had made her go through. He did not know that Mary could not wait for the last day to arrive to throw in his face all the rot she had discovered. One afternoon, Richard returned home earlier than expected and found Mary talking to me in the hallway. He looked at us with suspicion, but Mary did not lose her composure. She told him that we were just discussing the repairs necessary for some of her old clothes that she wanted to donate to charity. Richard nodded, but his eyes desperately sought a sign of affection in her eyes. He asked her if they could speak privately that evening. Mary consented with a simple nod of her head. I left with my heart beating fast, knowing that this would be the decisive night, the night in which the cruel bet would clash with the brutal reality of Mary's past and the destruction of John's company. As I went down the stairs of the building, I thought back on how much suffering had been enclosed in those 6 months within the walls of that luxury penthouse. Richard thought he was the master of the game, but Mary had brought him exactly where she wanted him, to the deepest point of his emotional vulnerability. The bet had been the fuse, but the past was the dynamite that was about to explode. Mary had told me that she was not seeking revenge, but justice for her father and for the son who was never born, and that justice was ready to be served on a silver platter precisely at the moment when Richard believed he had finally won the heart of the woman he had started to hate because of a bet. I could not help but wonder if Richard would survive the revelation that awaited him. He had spent his life crushing others to climb higher and higher, but Mary was about to show him that the height from which he would fall was such as to leave no hope of remaining unharmed. The villa, with its soft lights and its precious marbles, now seemed like a mausoleum waiting for its deceased. Mary was ready, with her documents and her pain transformed into strength, to close that game once and for all, just when the 6th month was about to strike, and the $1 million seemed by now the last of the worries for a man who was about to lose the only true thing he had ever touched in his existence of plastic. The night of truth arrived with a silence that seemed to suffocate every corner of that glass penthouse above the city rooftops. Richard had ordered a special dinner, the best the restaurants in the city could offer, and had candles placed on that crystal table that Mary had always looked at with so much coldness during those 6 months. I was there, officially to help with the service and arrange the last things in the wardrobe. But in reality, Mary had asked me to stay because she felt that this evening would be the last in that house. I could see everything through the ajar door of the kitchen. Richard was no longer the self-assured man who entered the club of notables as if he were the master of every single stone in the city. He moved with an unusual clumsiness, continuously adjusting his shirt collar and looking at his watch with a frequency that betrayed a deep anxiety. He was not waiting for the expiration of the 6 months with the desire to collect the $1 million. He instead seemed terrified by the idea that that time was really about to end. Mary came out of her room wearing a dark, simple dress, one of those I had sewn for her, respecting her will not to appear as a trophy for Richard. She wore no jewelry, she had no makeup, but her figure occupied the space with a strength that Richard could no longer manage with his usual arrogance. They sat at the table, and the clinking of the silverware on the crystal was the only sound that broke that unbearable tension. Richard tried to start a conversation, talking about the future, about how his life had changed in those months and how much he had learned to respect Mary's mind and strength. I saw that he reached out a hand toward hers, seeking a contact that Mary avoided with surgical precision, putting down the silverware and looking him straight in the eyes with an expression that left no room for any type of tenderness. Richard took a deep breath and began to speak with a voice that trembled slightly. He said he knew he had started everything in the wrong way, that their marriage was born under a dark star, but that as the weeks passed, he had discovered in her a unique person, a woman capable of disarming him emotionally as no one had ever done before. He admitted that he had been arrogant, used to winning and considering people as objects to fuel his competition. He spoke of the desire to start over, to transform that contract into something real, offering her to stay in the penthouse as his true wife without any more expiration dates or millions of dollars in the middle. He remained there, waiting for an answer, with the gaze of someone who is waiting for a sentence of condemnation or acquittal. Mary remained in silence for a time that seemed infinite. Then, with a calmness that made my blood freeze, she raised her head and gave start to the storm. She asked Richard if he really thought that a little luxury and a few sweet words could erase the rotten nature of their beginning. She asked him if he still remembered the bet made at the club, that challenge born among the laughter and the smoke of cigars to marry an obese woman only to prove he could control anyone. Richard turned pale, trying to stammer an excuse, but Mary did not let him speak. She revealed to him that she knew about the bet from the first moment he had presented himself at her door, and that she had agreed to enter that house not for his money, but for a much deeper and darker reason. Mary rose slowly and walked toward the study, signaling to Richard to follow her. I remained motionless in the hallway, with my heart beating wildly. Mary opened the drawer of Richard's desk and pulled out the documents we had found together, those related to the firm of her father John. She asked him if the name John Richards or the supply company Richards reminded him of anything. Richard looked at those papers with wide eyes, while Mary reminded him with a sharp voice how he had crushed that small company without mercy, only to steal the land and build his empire. She told him that her father was not just a number on a failing balance sheet, but an honest man who had not withstood the weight of shame and who had taken his own life because of his greed. Richard staggered, leaning against the desk. He tried to say that he did not know, that he did not remember every single company he had absorbed, but Mary interrupted him with a cry of suffocated rage. She yelled at him that he did not know because he had never cared anything about the people he stepped on to climb high. But the true stab was yet to arrive. Mary approached him until she felt his labored breathing and whispered to him the truth that would destroy him definitively. She revealed to him that when everything had collapsed, when her father had died and she and her mother had remained with nothing, she was pregnant. She told him that the stress, the hunger, and the pain caused by the ruin he had orchestrated had made her lose the baby. The silence that followed those words was more violent than an explosion. Richard seemed to have shrunk. His athletic figure was hunched under the weight of an unbearable guilt. Mary told him that he had not only destroyed a company or a family, he had destroyed a life that had never started. She explained to him that she had accepted the bet to see him fall, to make him fall in love with her, and then show him the monster she saw every time she looked at his face in the mirror. She wanted him to feel the same helplessness and the same void that she had felt for years. Richard fell onto the study chair, with his head in his hands, unable to emit a single sound. Mary returned to the living room and began to gather her few things. I approached her, trembling, and she looked at me with an infinite tiredness. She told me that the game was over and that there were no winners in that house. Richard came out of the study, dragging his feet, seeking with his gaze a shred of forgiveness that could not arrive. Mary looked at him one last time, telling him that his money would never be able to buy the dignity he had trampled, and that the $1 million would be the mark of his shame for the rest of his days. She turned toward the door of the penthouse without looking back, leaving that powerful man alone among his glass walls and his cold marbles. We walked out of that building together, and the air of the city finally seemed breathable. We walked under the trees, and Mary asked me to accompany her to the grave of her father John. We stayed there in silence for a long time. I knew that Mary had obtained her justice, but I also knew that the pain she carried inside would not vanish easily. Richard had remained in the penthouse, destroyed by the revelation of having caused the death of his own potential child without even knowing it. The bet had been won according to Simon's terms, but Richard had lost everything that truly mattered, realizing too late that the woman he had derided had been the only one to show him the truth about his empty soul. In the following days, the news of the confrontation began to leak out in the circles of the city. Richard was no longer seen at the club, and his business activities began to suffer inexplicable slowdowns. It was said that he spent his days closed at home, refusing to speak with anyone, including Simon. Mary had returned to her modest life, but she carried a new strength with her. She told me that she had finally settled her accounts with the past, but that the image of Richard destroyed in the chair continued to haunt her. It was not the satisfaction she expected. It was only a deep, bitter awareness of human fragility and the cruelty that arrogance can produce. I went to visit Mary after a week and found her tidying up old books in the library. She told me that Richard had tried to call her several times, sending her letters full of apologies and offers of compensation. Mary had not responded to any of them. She maintained that words no longer meant anything, and that there was no amount of money capable of bringing back John or the baby she had lost. However, I noticed that she kept one of Richard's letters on the table, not torn up, but carefully folded. It was as if she were evaluating whether that man was capable of a true change, or if it was just another attempt to manipulate the situation in his favor. Richard, meanwhile, was living his personal hell. Without Mary, the villa seemed like a mausoleum to him. Every corner reminded him of the contempt he had shown and the dignity with which she had responded. He began to look at his business with different eyes, realizing how many other lives he had damaged to get where he was. The bet with Simon made him sick, and the $1 million he was supposed to collect seemed stained with blood to him. He sought me out one evening, knowing that I was the only one who could talk to Mary, and implored me to tell her that he was willing to give up everything just to have a chance to make amends. I looked at him and saw a man who was finally beginning to feel the weight of reality. I told him that Mary was not looking for his economic sacrifice, but for proof that he could become a better man for himself and for the memory of those who were no longer there. Richard nodded in silence, with tears in his eyes. He knew that the road to forgiveness would be long and perhaps impossible to travel, but he was decided to take the first step. Mary, for her part, observed these small signs of transformation from afar, divided between the anger that had nourished her for years and the possibility of a redemption she had never dared to hope for the man who had been her tormentor. The tension in town was palpable. Everyone was waiting to see if that bond born as a game would break definitively, or if something new and true could be born from the ashes of destruction. Mary told me she was not ready to forgive, but that perhaps she was ready to stop hating. It was a precarious balance, a thin wire stretched over the abyss of the past. Richard, meanwhile, had begun to dismantle his most aggressive projects, seeking to compensate the families affected by his previous maneuvers, just as Mary had thrown in his face that terrible night in the penthouse. I felt that the story was not yet over. That cruel bet had opened a wound that could not be closed with a simple signature of divorce. There were too many lives involved, too many buried pains that were asking to be recognized. Mary and Richard were now tied by something much more powerful than $1 million. They were tied by the naked and raw truth that had placed them one in front of the other without any more masks or excuses. The glass and marble villa waited in the silence of the night, a mute witness of a destiny that was still looking for its definitive direction among the folds of a past that did not want to be forgotten. Richard spent several nights on the balcony of the penthouse, the same place where Mary used to watch the city. He wondered how he could have been so blind and cruel for so long. Mary's face, with her firmness and her pain, had become his only compass. He began to write a diary himself, trying to put order into the chaos of his soul and to find a meaning in everything that had happened since he had accepted Simon's challenge at the club. It was the beginning of a slow and painful transformation, a process that would lead him to clash with his own image and with the judgment of a city that did not easily forget the scandals of its most illustrious sons. Mary, in the silence of her home, continued to read her books, but sometimes she stopped to watch the rain outside the window, just as she had done in the penthouse. She wondered if Richard was really changing or if it was just another performance. She knew the time for games was over, but the time for forgiveness still seemed very far away. A horizon lost in the winter fog that wrapped everything in a veil of uncertainty and feverish waiting for what would happen when the 6 months of marriage were officially expired for the law and for the heart. The days that followed that night of storm in the penthouse seemed suspended in an unreal time. The 6-month deadline provided by the contract had now arrived, and the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Richard no longer tried to force Mary's presence. He limited himself to sending her a last formal message through his lawyer, asking her to meet him one last time, not in the penthouse, but in a neutral office to officially close every legal matter. Mary accepted, but she asked me to accompany her once again. We walked together toward the law firm. Mary was silent, wrapped in her dark coat, but her gaze was turned forward, fixed toward a future that no longer depended on Richard's gold. When we entered the meeting room, we found Richard sitting at a long wooden table. He no longer looked like the arrogant young millionaire. His face was marked by tiredness, and his clothes seemed almost too big for him, as if he had lost weight and vigor in those few weeks of solitude. Next to him was Simon, who was holding a leather folder and a check that shone under the light of the lamps. Simon began to speak in an excited tone, saying that the 6 months had passed and that Richard had won the bet. He placed the check for $1 million on the table, pushing it toward his friend with a knowing smile. Mary looked at that piece of paper with such deep contempt that Simon felt obliged to lower his gaze. Richard, however, did not touch the check. He remained staring at Mary for several minutes in a silence that made the air in the room almost solid. Then, with a slow and deliberate gesture, he took the check, raised it in front of everyone, and tore it to pieces, letting the fragments fall onto the expensive carpet of the office. Simon yelled, asking him if he had gone crazy, but Richard did not even answer him. He addressed only Mary, telling her in a firm voice that he did not want that money and that he no longer wanted to be the man who had accepted that challenge. He extracted another set of documents from his folder and slid them toward her. He explained that he had spent the last few weeks dismantling part of his holdings to create a compensation fund for all the firms he had crushed over the years, starting with John's. He had already started the procedures to return the land to the community and to finance a medical research center that would carry her father's name. Mary took the documents and began to read them carefully, while tears began to streak her face. They were not tears of joy, but the release of years of anger and mourning that finally found recognition. Richard told her that he knew this would not bring back John and would never be able to make up for the loss of the baby, but that it was the only way he knew to begin to atone for his faults. He added that from that day she was free, legally and morally, and that he would spend the rest of his life trying to deserve the fact of having walked beside her, even if only for 6 months and for the wrong reason. We left the office while Simon continued to curse at Richard, calling him weak and stupid. Mary did not say a word until we reached the open air. She looked at me and told me that for the first time she felt light, as if a huge weight had been lifted from her chest. However, I noticed that Mary put a hand to her stomach, a gesture I had seen many women in my family do in the past. She told me that for a few days she had been feeling strange, that she had morning sickness, and that her body seemed to change in a way she knew well, despite years having passed since her first pregnancy that ended in tragedy. We went together to the doctor the following day. The wait in the waiting room was charged with a different tension made of hope mixed with terror. When the doctor came out and confirmed that Mary was indeed pregnant, the world seemed to stop again. Mary burst into heavy crying, squeezing my hand so hard it hurt. It was a miracle she did not dare to hope for, a second chance that life offered her precisely when she had finished fighting her hardest battle. But there was a problem that tormented her. The father was Richard, the man she had hated with every fiber of her being, but who was now desperately trying to change. Mary spent the following weeks in reflective isolation. Richard continued to send her messages, no longer to ask her to return, but to update her on the progress of the compensations and to ask if she needed anything. Mary decided to meet him in a small park, far from the luxury penthouses and the offices of power. When he saw her, his gaze lit up with a hope that he immediately tried to contain so as not to offend her. Mary told him about the pregnancy with a bluntness that left him petrified. Richard fell to his knees on the wet grass, crying and asking if he could have the honor of being a father different from the man he had been until that moment. Mary did not promise him immediate forgiveness, nor did she promise him that they would return to being a happy couple. She told him that the child deserved an honest father, and that she would observe every action of his to understand if his transformation was real or only dictated by guilt. Richard accepted every condition of hers. He began to attend courses, to work in social services, and to live in a much more modest way, leaving the glass penthouse for a simpler apartment where there were no memories of the bet with Simon. The city began to see Richard no longer as the predator, but as a man who was painstakingly rebuilding his own soul. I continued to stay close to Mary throughout the pregnancy. I saw her flourish, despite the weight and physical difficulties, carrying forward her work at the library and taking care of the management of the fund named after John. Richard came to visit her every day, bringing her books and flowers, staying on the threshold of the door until she invited him to enter. It was a slow courtship, made of respect and long conversations about life, pain, and hope. I saw Mary begin to smile again, a smile that was no longer the mask of defiance, but the sign of a healing that was taking place in the depths of her heart. When the moment of birth arrived, Richard was there, outside the room, walking back and forth for hours, just as John had done years before when Mary was born. When he could finally hold his son in his arms, I saw a completely different man. He was not the millionaire who measured success in money. He was a father who finally understood the inestimable value of a human life. Mary looked at him while he held the baby, and for the first time, I saw forgiveness descend into her eyes like a silent blessing. She knew that the past could not be changed, but that the future was a blank sheet that they could begin to write together for the sake of that little being who bore both their names. A few months later, they decided to marry again. This time, there were no bets. There were no cynical friends or bored millionaires. It was a small ceremony in the old church near the house where Mary had grown up. Mary wore a simple dress, the same one I had sewn for her for the first time, but this time her face was radiant. Richard did not look at his watch and did not seek anyone's approval. He looked only at Mary and his son, aware that this was the greatest victory he had ever obtained in his life. Simon was not invited. It was said he had lost much of his fortune in even riskier bets, ending up in the oblivion of society. The story of Mary and Richard became a legend in the city, a story of how dignity and truth can win even against the cruelest bet and the blindest arrogance. Many people began to look at Mary with respect, no longer for her physical condition, but for the incredible strength she had demonstrated in transforming mud into true gold. Richard continued his work of compensation, becoming one of the main supporters of small businesses in the region, using his experience to protect those he once would have crushed without mercy. He had understood that true wealth does not reside in the bank account, but in the capacity to look at oneself in the mirror without feeling shame. I am now old, and I have seen many stories, but Mary's will always stay in my heart as proof that no one is ever entirely lost if they have the courage to face their own monsters. Mary comes to visit me often with the child, who now runs happily under the trees, and every time I see them together, I thank heaven for allowing me to be the witness of this miracle of redemption. Richard's bet was the biggest mistake of his life, but paradoxically, it was also his salvation, because it forced him to clash with the only woman who could not be bought. I hope that this story has made you reflect on how important human dignity is, and how the consequences of our actions always chase us until we decide to face them with honesty. Mary never sought to be different from what she was, and precisely for this reason, she managed to change the world around her. Richard had to lose everything to find himself, demonstrating that the deepest fall can be the beginning of the most glorious ascent. The city continues to live with its secrets and its stories, but this one will remain forever engraved as a hymn to the strength of women and to the possibility of a true and profound change. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for having listened to me today and for having allowed me to share with you this very intimate fragment of my memory. I hope that the account of Mary and Richard has touched your soul and has given you a moment of reflection on the power of forgiveness and justice. If my story has touched you, do not hesitate to leave a like and to subscribe to this channel for more testimonies. I also invite you to share this video with the people you love. Sometimes, a story of hope and change can give the necessary courage to someone who is going through a difficult moment or feels oppressed by the arrogance of others. Before saying goodbye, I would very much like to know what you think in the comments. In your opinion, did Mary do well to give Richard a chance after everything she discovered? And you, in her place, how would you have reacted? Tell me also from which part of the world you are listening to me today. I always read your messages with great joy. Thank you again from the bottom of my heart for the time you have dedicated to me. I wish you every good thing and hope to find you again soon for a new story.